A billionaire stepped into the rain and found a little girl selling wilted roses for her mother's medicine. What she whispered to him that night cut deeper than any boardroom deal. Rain fell hard and steady on the city, blurring the glow of traffic lights into red and gold streaks that shivered across the wet pavement. Victor Hale stood beneath the glass awning of the restaurant, the collar of his tailored coat turned up against the wind, his driver waiting somewhere down the block. The investors he had just left behind were laughing in the private dining room, their voices muffled by thick walls and thicker egos, but Victor no longer felt part of their world. He wanted air, even if it was heavy with rain, even if it soaked the street until every step was a splash. He looked down the avenue and saw the usual late-night rhythm: umbrellas tilting, taxis honking, people rushing to escape the weather. But then his eyes caught on a smaller figure that did not move like the others. She was standing near the curb, her hair plastered dark against her face, her clothes clinging to her thin frame. In her arms she carried a bundle of flowers wrapped in old newspaper, roses bent at odd angles, petals bruised by the storm. She was young, too young to be out in such weather, and yet she stood there stubbornly, like the rain could not force her away. A boy might have hidden beneath an awning, a teenager might have given up and gone home, but this girl seemed to have no place else to be. Victor adjusted his tie, pretending to check his phone, but his gaze returned again and again to her small figure. Cars hissed past, throwing up water that splashed her shoes, but she did not flinch. He could not hear her from across the street, but he could imagine the quiet plea she must have offered to the passers-by. "A flower, please, just one flower." Yet most people walked past her without slowing, their umbrellas angled to block her from sight. He thought about the dinner he had just left, the millions pledged for his next project, the easy way those men had ordered wine that cost more than her entire bundle of roses. He thought about how his own name now meant numbers on a screen, columns of profit and projections, and not the boy who had once stood outside a grocery store trying to sell candy bars to help his mother pay for rent. The rain drummed louder against the awning, pulling him back into the present moment, into the sight of that child refusing to leave her corner. Victor's driver pulled up to the curb, the black sedan gleaming under the rain, the door swinging open like a waiting mouth. But Victor did not step forward. Instead, he stayed where he was, his eyes locked on the girl who had nothing except a handful of wilted flowers and the courage to stand in the storm. Something in him shifted then, small but undeniable, as if the night itself had handed him a choice. He could step into the warmth of the car and leave her unseen, or he could cross the street and find out why she would not move. The rain poured harder, but Victor Hale took a breath, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he stepped off the curb. The rain eased into a mist, but the streets still shone slick and silver under the city lights, and Victor felt the cold creep into his shoes as he crossed to the other side. The girl had not moved from her spot, though her dress clung to her legs and her hair dripped into her eyes. She looked up when she saw him coming, a quick flash of watchfulness that belonged more to someone grown than to a child. She hugged the bundle of roses to her chest as if they were worth far more than they looked, each stem wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, the ink bleeding into dark stains from the water. Victor stopped in front of her, unsure of what to say, but she saved him from the silence. She lifted her chin and spoke in a voice soft yet firm, the kind of tone a child uses when she has practiced the words many times. She held out a single rose, petals torn by the storm, and said it was for someone who doesn't smile enough. The sentence was simple, but it landed in him with a weight he had not expected. He tried to answer with something casual, maybe a joke, but his throat tightened instead, so he only looked at her and nodded. Her small bare feet shifted against the wet pavement as she pushed the flower closer to him. He noticed how thin her arms were, how her fingernails carried faint traces of dirt, how her eyes seemed older than her face. He took the rose carefully, afraid the fragile petals would collapse in his hand, and the newspaper around the stem left ink on his fingers. She watched him closely, as if his reaction meant something important, as if the success of her night depended not only on the coins he might give, but on whether he understood her words. Victor cleared his throat and asked her name. She said it was Lila. Just Lila. No last name offered, as if it did not matter. He asked how long she had been standing in the rain, and she only shrugged. People hurry more when it rains, she explained. Sometimes they pity her and buy quickly. Sometimes they avoid her even more. She did not sound bitter, only factual, the way a shopkeeper might explain how business changes with the weather. He looked down the block where his car still waited, black and gleaming under the streetlight, and then back at the small girl holding wilted roses as though they were treasure. The difference between his world and hers stretched wide in front of him, yet her calm voice bridged it with a few simple words. For someone who doesn't smile enough. He realized she had studied him, not just tonight, but maybe many nights, and had seen what even his closest associates failed to notice. Victor reached for his wallet, but Lila shook her head quickly, water spraying from her hair. She did not want charity, she said, only for him to keep the flower and maybe remember to smile. He stood there in the soft drizzle, holding a rose that was already beginning to wilt, and wondered when the last time was that anyone had offered him something with no price attached. Victor held the flower awkwardly, the stem bent beneath his grip, the petals already bruised from the weather. He wanted to hand it back or pay her too much for it, but before he could speak she leaned a little closer, her voice carrying in the drizzle like something fragile but sharp. Sometimes people need proof that they're still alive, she whispered. And then she stepped back, as if she had given him something more than a flower, something invisible that weighed heavier than gold. The words settled inside him with a force he did not expect, cutting through his thoughts more sharply than any deal, sharper than any argument. In a boardroom full of powerful men, for a moment he did not know what to say. He had been praised with eloquent speeches, he had been courted with promises of billions, but nothing had pierced him the way this child's sentence had. Proof that you are still alive, he repeated silently, wondering when the last time was that he had felt anything close to that. His life was made of meetings, contracts, flights across continents, endless dinners where people smiled but never meant it. He built towers of code and money, yet none of it felt like proof, only repetition. He thought of his office with its cold glass walls, his empty penthouse with its view of the skyline, and realized how little of it carried warmth. Lila stood in front of him, her feet on the wet pavement, her eyes searching his face for a reaction. She was not begging, not even asking, she was simply giving a truth she had discovered far too young. He cleared his throat and tried to steady his voice, asking her why she said that. She answered simply, because when people buy a flower, they smile, even if only for a moment, and that smile is proof they are still alive. She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He looked down at the rose in his hand, wilted and damp, and saw it differently now. Not a transaction, not a gesture, but a reminder. He felt his chest tighten with something he could not name, a memory of his mother humming softly while arranging wildflowers in a chipped glass jar, years before she got sick, years before his world turned into a climb he could not stop. He had forgotten that feeling, forgotten the proof she used to give him without knowing it. The traffic roared past them, headlights streaking across puddles, yet in that moment it felt as if the whole city had gone quiet. Victor realized he was still staring at the child, and she tilted her head with a half smile, as though she had tested him and was waiting to see if he understood. He finally asked her how much for the rose, but she shook her head again, telling him it was not for sale, it was for him, because he needed it. The words echoed long after she turned back to her bundle of flowers, long after he stepped away toward his car. He slid into the leather seat, the driver asking if everything was all right, and Victor said nothing. He only stared at the rose in his hand, her voice repeating in his mind, proof that you're still alive, and he realized he had never wanted words to linger more than these. The black sedan glided to the curb, its headlights scattering across the wet pavement, the driver stepping out quickly with an umbrella already raised. He called for Victor in the practiced tone of a man who had done this countless times, but Victor did not move toward him. Instead, he lifted one hand in a simple wave, a signal to stand down. The driver hesitated, confusion flashing in his eyes, but Victor's gaze did not leave the small figure at his side. After a moment, the car rolled forward and disappeared into the blur of rain and neon, leaving Victor on the sidewalk beside the girl who still clutched her bundle of wilted roses. She glanced up at him, surprised that he had not taken the easy escape, but she said nothing. The city hummed around them, taxis splashing through puddles, late-night workers hurrying by, 1,000 stories carried on the wet air, yet Victor found himself focused only on this one. He adjusted his coat and asked if he might walk with her. She gave a small shrug that was neither yes nor no, only the tired gesture of a child who had learned to accept whatever came. They moved down the block together, her small steps quick to keep pace with his longer stride. She hugged the roses to her chest, the newspaper dripping black stains down her arms, and Victor noticed again how thin she was, how her shoulders trembled though she never complained. He asked where she lived, who sent her out here, and she answered with a calmness that startled him. No one sent her, she said. She sold flowers. Because someone had to. Because her mother was too sick to stand in the rain, and rent did not wait for better weather. Victor listened carefully, the way he listened to market reports and investor briefings, but the difference was stark. This was not numbers or projections. This was survival spoken in the plain words of a 9-year-old girl. She said she had been doing this since summer, sometimes barefoot, sometimes with shoes too small, sometimes ignored for hours until one kind soul stopped to buy. He asked if she ever went to school, and she nodded, though she admitted she often arrived late, sometimes without homework, because nights were for selling and mornings for sleeping. The drizzle softened into a mist, the air heavy with the smell of rain on asphalt. Victor realized he was walking streets he rarely saw, except through tinted windows, corners where children stood invisible to men like him. He asked her why she had spoken to him the way she had, why she had offered the flower with those strange words. She tilted her head and studied him for a long moment before answering. She said she could tell when people carried heavy hearts, and his was heavier than most. Flowers did not change lives, she said, but sometimes they reminded people they still had one. They reached the next corner, and she paused beneath a broken streetlight, her bundle of roses pressed tight to her chest, her eyes still watchful, but no longer afraid. Victor felt something stir inside him, a quiet vow forming without his permission, that he would not walk away from this child, as so many others had. For the first time in years he ignored the pull of his schedule, the messages vibrating in his pocket, and chose instead to keep walking beside her, needing to know where this path might lead. The café sat on the corner, with its yellow sign buzzing faintly, a small place open later than it should be, the kind of spot Victor had never stepped into before. The bell above the door rang when he pushed it open, and a wash of warm air rolled over them, heavy with the smell of coffee and bread. Lila hesitated on the threshold, clutching her roses, dripping water onto the floor, but he guided her inside with a nod, and the promise that she could rest for a while. The waitress behind the counter raised her brows at the sight of them together but said nothing, only pointed to a booth near the window where the light was soft and the glass fogged with condensation from the storm outside. They sat across from each other, Victor in his tailored coat, with droplets clinging to the fabric, Lila in her soaked dress, with the newspaper around her flowers, bleeding ink into her arms. He picked up the menu, though he knew she could not afford anything listed, and when the waitress came over he ordered without asking, a bowl of soup, grilled cheese, hot chocolate with extra cream. Lila's eyes widened slightly at the sound of the order, but she kept her head down, strands of wet hair plastered to her cheek. The food came quickly, steam rising from the bowl, butter melting across toasted bread, and Victor slid the plate toward her with a quiet firmness that did not leave room for refusal. She hesitated only a moment before setting her roses carefully on the seat beside her and picking up the spoon. The first sip was small, cautious, as if she was afraid the warmth might vanish if she rushed. Then hunger took over, though she never ate messily, only with a quiet focus that spoke louder than words. Victor watched, his hands folded on the table, the rose she had given him still lying near his elbow. He thought of all the dinners he had attended where food was art, where plates cost more than rent, and how little those meals had ever mattered. This simple soup and bread in a corner café meant more because of the way Lila's shoulders eased with each bite, because of the way her eyes flicked up now and then to check if it was really allowed for her to eat until she was full. When she paused, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, he asked if she came here often. She shook her head and said she usually stayed outside, because buying even a single roll would take away from the money she needed for medicine. He asked about her mother, and she answered softly, saying she coughed through the nights, that some days she could not get out of bed, that the flowers kept the landlord from knocking too hard on the door. Victor felt a knot form in his chest. Not pity exactly, but something heavier. The sense that this girl had carried burdens that no child should ever have known. Outside, the rain streaked the glass, blurring the world into shadows and light, while inside the booth, the silence between them grew warmer, filled not with discomfort, but with a fragile kind of trust. Lila finished the last bite, whispered a thank you that was more breath than voice, and folded her hands in her lap. Victor realized then that nothing in his day, not the contracts, not the profits, not the carefully negotiated deals, had mattered as much as the simple act of giving a child shelter and food in the middle of a storm. The café had quieted as the hour grew later, only a few customers scattered at tables, the hum of the coffee machine filling the silence. Lila sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, her bundle of flowers resting beside her like a loyal companion. The steam from the empty soup bowl curled upward and faded into the air, and for the first time since they sat down, Victor saw her body relax just a little. The edge of hunger softened, though not erased. He leaned back against the booth, the rose she had given him still close at hand, and asked her gently why she had been out on the street alone in the rain. She answered without hesitation, her voice flat but steady, as if she had rehearsed these words countless times. She said she sold flowers every night, no matter the weather, because the medicine her mother needed cost more than she could ever save if she did not. She said it the way a clerk might explain store hours, matter of fact, not expecting sympathy, just reciting the truth. Victor felt the words settle over him like stones. He asked about her father, and she shook her head, eyes steady but distant, saying he had left years ago and never came back, leaving them with nothing but a stack of unpaid bills and a silence that grew heavier with each passing year. Victor tried to imagine what that must have been like, a child watching the door close behind the man who should have stayed. He thought of his own father, strict and cold, but at least present, at least there. Lila had not even been given that. She spoke again before he could gather his thoughts, telling him the landlord came by every week, warning that if the rent was late again he would throw them out. She said it plainly, no tremor in her voice, as though she had accepted that threats were just part of the air she breathed. Victor studied her carefully, the small shoulders drawn tight, the way her eyes did not flinch when she delivered such heavy truths. She reminded him of the young interns he had once met, the ones hardened by life before they ever had a chance to be carefree, but she was only 9 years old. He asked if anyone helped her, teachers, neighbors, family, and she only shrugged, saying people were kind sometimes, but kindness never lasted. Flowers, she said, at least made money, even if it was never enough. He felt anger rising in him, anger not at her but at the world that had placed her in this position. He had spent years building networks to protect information, to guard systems. Yet here was a child who had to guard her own survival with nothing but roses wrapped in newspaper. She did not ask for pity or for help. She only explained it as if reporting facts, like someone used to adults not really listening. The weight of her story pressed into Victor's chest, breaking through the walls he had built around his life. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the city lights softening against the damp streets. But inside the booth, he felt something fracture in him, the certainty that his money and success were enough to insulate him from pain. Lila had revealed a truth he could not ignore, and it settled over him with the quiet strength of a child who had been speaking the truth all along, waiting for someone to finally hear it. Victor let the silence sit between them for a moment, the clink of dishes from the counter filling the space. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and asked the questions that pressed at him, the questions any adult should ask when faced with a child carrying burdens far too heavy. "Where are your teachers?" he asked. "Where are the people meant to watch over you, the social workers who are supposed to keep children safe?" Lila shrugged, her small shoulders rising and falling with a quietness that cut deeper than words. "They come and go," she said simply. "Flowers stay." The sentence struck him harder than he expected. He stared at her, the fogged window behind her turning her figure into a small silhouette outlined by the city lights. She explained in the same calm tone that teachers noticed her sometimes, but always moved on to other children who made more noise, who demanded more attention. Social workers visited now and then, took notes on clipboards, nodded with sympathy, but then they disappeared and never came back. She did not say it with bitterness, only with the steady voice of someone who had learned not to expect consistency. "Flowers stay," she repeated, and the way she said it felt older than her years. Selling them was the one constant, the one thing that did not vanish or forget her. Victor's chest tightened. He thought of his own life, of investors who stayed only as long as profits rose, of board members who praised him in one season and questioned him in the next. He understood too well the instability she described, though she lived it in a way far harsher than he ever had. He asked her how long she had been selling them. She tilted her head as if calculating, then said since the spring when her mother grew too weak to stand outside, since the day she realized no one else was going to help them. Victor tried to imagine her, smaller than she was now, standing on wet corners with bundles of roses, holding them up to strangers taller and busier and colder than she could ever be. He felt a deep ache in his chest that no victory in business had ever reached. The waitress walked past, refilling cups at another table, and Victor noticed how Lila's eyes followed her for a moment, not with envy, but with quiet longing, as if the simple act of carrying a tray and being paid regularly was a dream too distant to reach. He asked if she ever wanted to do something else, anything besides selling flowers. She looked at him then, her eyes large and steady, and said she wanted to be a teacher someday, because teachers leave, but maybe she could be one who stayed. Her words echoed through him like a warning bell, striking at the walls he had built around himself. All his success, all his power, and here was a child who understood permanence better than he did. He sat back, the rose still lying near his hand, and realized he had no easy answers for her questions or his own. The elevator opened with a soft chime, and Victor stepped into the wide stillness of his penthouse. The city stretched beneath the glass walls, lights shimmering on the slick streets below, but he barely noticed the view that usually reminded him of his triumphs. He hung his coat on the chair and loosened his tie, his shoes echoing faintly on the polished floor. The silence was complete except for the hum of the building's systems, a silence he had once prized, but tonight it felt hollow. In his hand he still carried the rose Lila had given him, its stem bent, its petals softening with the weight of rain. He crossed to his office, the room where he spent most of his nights, and laid the flower on the glass desk that held multiple screens, glowing with contracts, graphs, and projections of profit. Numbers scrolled endlessly, blue and green lights flickered like constellations in code, but the fragile bloom on the dark surface drew his eyes again and again. It looked small, almost absurd, against the spread of technology and wealth, yet he felt it pressing down with more weight than everything else combined. He sat heavily in his chair, leaning back, as if the day had taken more from him than any deal could. He thought of Lila's words, spoken with the plain courage of a child. Sometimes people need proof that they're still alive. He had nodded at the time, but now, in the emptiness of his home, he felt the truth burn through him. When had he last felt alive, in a way that was not tied to money or victory? The moments blurred together, dinners with investors, speeches at conferences, contracts signed with pens made of silver, but none of it brought the sharp clarity that a single wet rose had carried. He remembered the café, the way steam had fogged the window, the way she had eaten her soup carefully, as if each spoonful mattered. He thought of her small voice explaining rent and medicine, her shrug when asked about teachers, her simple belief that flowers stayed while people disappeared. He lifted the rose and held it up against the glow of the monitors, and for the first time he noticed the faint sweetness of its scent. It was dying already, petals curling at the edges, yet even in decay, it held more truth than the endless reports stacked across his desk. His phone vibrated, a message from his COO reminding him of tomorrow's meeting with international partners. Another opportunity to expand, to climb higher. Victor set the phone down without replying. He felt a shift inside him, faint but unmistakable, a crack forming in the certainty he had lived by. He had built his life to prove he could rise above the past. But what did it mean if a child standing in the rain had more resilience, more honesty, than all the men in his boardroom? The rose lay quietly in front of him, fragile yet unyielding, and Victor knew he could not ignore what it represented. For the first time in years, he leaned back from his screens and let himself wonder what his success was worth if it did not reach children like her. The night pressed cold against the city, the rain gone but the wind sharp enough to slice through coats and scarves. Victor walked with his hands in his pockets, his driver trailing behind in the car a block away, told to circle until he was called. He did not want the easy warmth of leather seats tonight. He wanted to walk the streets that had begun to feel different since the child's words had lodged in his mind. He told himself he was only curious, only checking if she might still be there, though deep down he knew he hoped she was. When he turned the corner, he saw her. Lila stood in the same spot near the curb, her bundle of flowers wrapped in fresh newspaper, her small frame braced against the gusts of wind. The traffic sprayed cold mist from the gutters, but she held her chin high, scanning faces as they passed, her eyes sharp and steady. When she saw him approaching, her lips curved into a small smile that carried no surprise, only quiet confirmation, as if she had expected him to return, as if she had tested whether his word meant anything at all. "You came back," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the rush of cars, but her eyes fixed on him with the certainty of someone who had known disappointment often enough to recognize its opposite. Victor nodded, feeling something stir in his chest. He asked if she had sold many flowers today, and she shook her head, hugging the bundle closer. "People hurried more when it was cold," she explained. "They buried their faces in scarves. They didn't want to stop." Flowers looked out of place against a wind that made every hand ache. He stood beside her for a moment, unsure what to say, then asked if she had eaten. She looked down at her shoes, which were too thin for the weather, and shrugged. "Sometimes," she said, "soup if they had enough left after rent, but sometimes just bread." She spoke with the same calm voice she had used the night before, as though these details were ordinary, as though hunger was simply part of the rhythm of her days. Victor glanced at the roses, their edges curling in the cold, and thought of the boardroom where he had left a meeting unfinished to come here, a meeting where men in suits argued over profit margins that dwarfed the price of every flower in her arms. He wondered what those men would think if they saw him standing here, a billionaire with frozen fingers, listening to a 9-year-old explain survival. She lifted one flower and held it toward him again, not as a sale, but as a gift. "For someone who looks like they forgot something," she said. though she did not explain what. He took it slowly, the stem brittle from the cold, and realized she had already given him more than he could ever repay. The wind rattled down the street, tugging at his coat, and Victor knew he could not leave her to face it alone again. He told her to walk with him, to a café, or anywhere warm, and for the first time, he saw hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of a child's fear that this might be another promise soon broken. But when he extended his hand, she placed her small fingers in his without a word, and together they stepped away from the corner. For Victor, it felt less like an act of charity, and more like a beginning, the return, not to her, but to himself, to the part of him that had long been waiting to be tested and found true. The café was warmer this time, the heater humming in the corner, though the windows still trembled under the push of wind outside. Victor slid into the booth across from Lila, the same booth as the night before, and ordered her food without asking. She did not protest, only placed her flowers on the seat beside her and pulled a small notebook from the pocket of her coat. She set it on the table between them with the kind of seriousness that made Victor lean closer. The cover was soft from use, corners bent, pages smudged with faint water stains, but she opened it carefully, smoothing the creases with her small hand. Inside, the pages were filled with rows of numbers. At first glance it looked messy, columns uneven, some figures crammed into the margins, but as Victor studied it, he saw a clear pattern. Each day had a tally of flowers sold, money earned, and beneath that, the costs, always the same three categories: medicine, rent, and food. She had drawn rough lines to divide them, as though mimicking the ledgers of a business, and though her handwriting wobbled, the math itself was flawless. Victor felt his chest tighten as he read the figures. Small amounts circled, totals carried from one page to the next, balances carefully subtracted until the margin left was almost always near nothing. He asked her who had taught her to keep records like this. She shrugged and said no one. She had learned by watching the way shopkeepers counted change, by listening when her teacher once explained subtraction, and by trial and error. The precision was her own, sharpened not by lessons, but by necessity. He turned a page and saw notes scribbled beside the numbers. If she sold fewer than 10 flowers one night, she wrote a reminder to stay out longer the next. If the rent due was higher because of fees, she marked it with an asterisk. One page carried the word hope, written faintly in the corner, as though she had allowed herself a thought that did not belong to the numbers. Victor ran his hand over the notebook but did not touch the fragile paper. He thought of the spreadsheets his team sent him, projections built by analysts with degrees from the best universities, and realized this child had built a ledger with more discipline than some of his senior staff. He thought of his own childhood, watching his mother stretch dollars across a week, but he had never recorded them with such accuracy. He had only waited for escape. Lila was not waiting. She was fighting, one rose at a time. She watched him closely as he studied her work, her face calm but her eyes sharp, as if she needed to know whether he would laugh at her effort or take it seriously. He met her gaze and said the math was perfect, and the way her shoulders eased told him it was the first time an adult had spoken that truth aloud. Victor closed the notebook gently and slid it back toward her. He realized then that what lay on those pages was not just arithmetic. It was a life measured in petals and coins, a map of survival that no child should ever have to write. Yet she had written it, night after night, with the steady courage of someone determined not to be erased. The night had grown colder, the wind sweeping litter along the gutters, but Lila walked with steady steps, her bundle of roses pressed against her chest. Victor kept pace beside her, his long stride slowing to match hers, his hand ready at her elbow though she never stumbled. He had insisted on walking her home, unwilling to let her vanish into the dark streets with nothing more than a wave. She had looked at him with suspicion at first, the kind of suspicion learned from promises broken too many times, but then she had nodded, as if deciding to test whether he meant it. They turned down narrower streets where the shine of glass towers faded into peeling paint and rusted fences. Victor felt the city shift around them, the noise thinning, the glow dimming, until they stopped in front of a worn building with bricks darkened by years of rain. The steps creaked under their weight, and the hallway smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke. Lila moved without hesitation, climbing to the third floor and pulling a key from a string around her neck. The door opened to a space that made Victor pause. The apartment was bare, the kind of bare that spoke not of design but of necessity. A couch with cushions, frayed at the edges, stood against one wall, a single lamp flickering weakly, and a small table cluttered with pill bottles and unpaid bills. The floor was clean but worn, the walls patched in places where paint had peeled away. There were no toys, no decorations, only the bare bones of a life stripped down to survival. On the couch lay a woman, thin beneath a blanket, her face pale with exhaustion. She tried to sit up when they entered, pushing herself upright with effort, but her cough broke the silence before she could speak. Lila hurried to her side, setting down the roses and smoothing the blanket with practiced hands. The woman looked at Victor, her eyes filled with apology before she even spoke. She whispered that she was sorry her daughter had caused trouble, sorry for the inconvenience, her voice carrying both pride and shame. Victor could not find words. He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the fragility of the woman, the strength of the child beside her, and felt a weight heavier than any boardroom pressure settle in his chest. Numbers filled his days, contracts and figures that told him whether ventures would rise or fall, but here was a truth no spreadsheet could soften. Here was survival measured not in profits but in breaths, in pills lined up carefully on a table, in a child's determination to sell flowers so her mother could rest a little longer. Lila glanced up at him, her hand still smoothing the blanket, her expression calm as if daring him to look away, daring him to pretend this was not real. Victor did not look away. He stood in silence, the image searing itself into him, knowing that whatever he chose to do next would matter more than any deal he had ever made. Victor returned to his penthouse well past midnight, his coat still carrying the chill of the wind from the streets where Lila lived. He moved through the wide rooms without turning on many lights, letting the city glow bleed through the windows, shadows stretching across polished floors and glass walls. He set his phone on the counter, untouched despite the dozens of messages waiting, and poured himself a glass of water he did not drink. He sat at his desk, the rose she had given him still resting there, its petals drooping but holding on, and let his mind turn backward in ways he usually avoided. He remembered his own childhood, not in fragments, but in sharp, unsoftened images. His mother sitting at a small wooden table with fabric spread across her lap, her hands working a needle long after midnight, while he lay on a narrow bed, pretending to sleep. He remembered the quiet sighs she made when her eyes grew heavy, the lamp flickering in the corner, the sound of thread pulling tight through cloth. He remembered how she would kiss his forehead in the morning with tired lips, telling him to be brave, telling him that better days would come, though he could hear the strain in her voice. He remembered his father, too, though the memory was colder. The man had left one evening without explanation, his boots echoing on the floor, the door closing with a finality that even as a boy Victor had understood. No argument, no promises, only absence. He had waited days for his return, waiting for a knock or a voice, until his mother finally told him the truth, that he was gone and was not coming back. The memory of that silence still burned, a wound that had never fully closed, driving him to build an empire with his own hands, to prove he would never be powerless again, never abandoned to shadows and unanswered questions. And yet, standing in Lila's apartment earlier that night, seeing the flickering lamp, the thin blanket around her mother, the child who had taken the burden onto her own shoulders, he had felt as though he was looking back through time. She was fighting the same storms he thought he had escaped, storms of poverty and loss, and fear that adults would not stay, that promises would break like glass. The sight had cracked open something he had buried under success and wealth. Something raw and unfinished. Victor leaned back in his chair and let the memories wash through him. He had believed money could shield him, that building towers of profit would silence the ghosts of his past. But money could not erase the look in Lila's eyes as she laid her notebook on the table, could not soften the sound of her mother's cough or the way the apartment seemed to hold more absence than presence. He realized then that his empire was not proof he had won, it was only armor. And armor was heavy when you carried it alone. He looked again at the fading rose, fragile but still upright, and felt an ache in his chest. Old wounds had taught him to fight, but perhaps they were now teaching him to see. The first light of dawn crept across the city, pale and uncertain, painting the glass towers with faint gold. Victor had not slept, his mind running through memories and questions that refused to quiet. He had spent hours pacing between his office and the wide window, the fading rose still on his desk, the silence of the penthouse pressing against him. When his phone buzzed with reminders of the day ahead, meetings lined up like dominoes, he felt the old reflex to obey the calendar, to keep moving forward no matter the cost. Yet something in him resisted, something planted by a child's quiet words, and the sight of a bare apartment where survival hung by threads. He picked up the phone before the sun had fully risen, dialing the number he knew by heart. His COO answered groggily, his voice thick with sleep, but quickly sharpened when he realized who was calling. The man began listing details of the morning's schedule, the contracts to be signed, the deal that was supposed to anchor their expansion into another market. Victor listened only long enough to hear the edge of urgency in his tone, then interrupted with a firmness that startled even himself. "Suspend the signing," he said. "Delay it until further notice." There was a pause on the other end, disbelief hanging in the silence. His COO asked if something was wrong, if negotiations had collapsed overnight. Victor stared at the rose on his desk, its stem bowed, its petals still holding on against time, and said simply that there was something more important. The words surprised him as they left his mouth, not because they were untrue, but because he had never allowed anything else to outweigh business before. The COO pressed for an explanation, reminding him of the investors waiting, of the headlines they had promised, of the millions at stake. Victor repeated his instruction with the same steady tone. No anger, no hesitation, only certainty. "Reschedule it," he said. "I will handle the fallout." The COO stammered, then finally agreed, though his confusion was clear. When the call ended, Victor set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding as if he had just leapt from a height. The choice felt reckless by the measures he had lived by, but he knew it was right. He thought of Lila standing barefoot in the rain, of her notebook filled with careful numbers, of her mother whispering apologies from a worn couch. Those images had not left him, and they would not until he did something about them. The deal could wait, money could wait, but the fragile line between survival and collapse in that apartment could not. He poured himself a coffee he did not drink, staring out at the brightening sky, and let the decision settle into him. For the first time in years, he felt that he had chosen not out of strategy or profit, but out of something deeper, something that mattered beyond numbers. He whispered the words again, almost to himself, "There's something more important," and realized he had never believed them so completely. The boardroom gleamed with polished wood and steel, the long table set with tablets and water glasses that caught the overhead light. Victor entered without the usual calm armor he wore, carrying instead the weight of a decision he knew would shake the room. His directors were already assembled, a half-circle of sharp suits and sharper eyes, their expressions guarded as they scrolled through the morning's agenda. They expected updates on the suspended deal, answers for the delay that had already unsettled investors. Instead, Victor placed a folder on the table, his movements deliberate, and announced that he wanted to discuss a new initiative. He explained it plainly: a housing and healthcare program, funded not by the company but by himself, a personal commitment to support families like the one he had seen the night before. He laid out the framework: apartments refurbished for stability, clinics partnered to provide affordable medicine, scholarships for children caught between survival and opportunity. He spoke without the usual jargon, his voice steady, his eyes focused not on charts, but on the memory of Lila's thin shoulders and her mother's fading breath. The silence that followed was heavy, then fractured by protest. One director leaned forward, his tone sharp, accusing Victor of distraction at a critical moment. Another shook her head, calling the idea sentimentality dressed as strategy, reminding him that they were a technology company, not a charity. Words circled the room like blades: profit margins, shareholder confidence, fiduciary duty. They asked why he would tie his name to something so far from the company's core, why he would divert his energy when expansion deals waited on his approval. Victor listened, his jaw tight, feeling the pull of two worlds: the one he had built, defined by profit, efficiency, and relentless growth, and the one that had broken through his walls when a child handed him a wilted rose. He understood their fear, understood the pressure to keep the machine running, but he also understood that if he turned away now, he would be no different from the adults Lila described, the ones who came and went, who promised but never stayed. He told them he was not asking for permission. He was informing them. The initiative would be funded from his personal wealth, his own resources, no impact to the company's accounts. Even so, they argued it would dilute his focus, that investors would question his priorities, that he risked being seen as weak. He met their objections with calm certainty, saying that true weakness was hiding behind profit while people drowned in plain sight. The room bristled with discomfort. Some directors looked away, others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one could break the conviction in his voice. For the first time in years, Victor felt he was speaking not as a CEO, but as a man reclaiming something he had lost. The pull of profit was strong, but the pull of purpose was stronger, and he knew which one he would choose. The afternoon was pale with winter light when Victor arrived at Lila's building, his car idling at the curb while he climbed the narrow stairs. She opened the door cautiously, her eyes darting past him, as if to make sure he was real, not another promise that would vanish by evening. Her mother was on the couch again, her cough sharper now, the sound of lungs fighting for air. Victor spoke gently, telling them both that he wanted to take them to a clinic, not tomorrow or next week but now. The mother began to shake her head, embarrassment and pride mixing in her tired eyes, but Lila looked at him steadily, the way she had on the corner with her flowers, and asked if he truly meant it. He said yes, and this time he let the word carry the weight of action. The clinic was bright and clean, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air, the staff bustling with quiet urgency. Victor stayed close as the nurses helped Lila's mother into a chair, her body weak, but her dignity intact. The receptionist began to ask about insurance and payment, but Victor cut her off, placing his card on the counter, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "Cover everything," he said, "not just tonight, but ongoing, as long as it takes." The staff glanced at him with recognition, some whispering his name, but he ignored it. His attention stayed on Lila, who stood close by, watching each detail with the fierce concentration of someone used to testing whether adults would keep their word. When the doctor arrived, Lila moved to the side, her hand clutching her notebook as if she might need to record every instruction. She listened to each word, her eyes scanning the prescription notes, her head tilting when the doctor explained treatments. Victor noticed how she kept glancing back at him, waiting for the moment when he might falter, when he might look at the cost and pull away. But he did not falter. He nodded at every recommendation, authorized every test, and stayed in the room as her mother's breathing eased slightly under medication. The hours passed, the mother resting at last, her chest rising more evenly, her face less pale. Victor found himself sitting in a plastic chair beside Lila, who had not left his side. She asked him quietly if this was really allowed. If someone like her mother could actually stay until she was well. He told her yes, and that the bills would not follow them home like shadows. Her lips pressed together, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softened for a moment, as though a small corner of doubt had lifted. By the time they left the clinic that evening, the city lights were flickering on. Victor helped Lila's mother into the car, and Lila climbed in after her, still clutching her notebook, still watchful. She said little, but Victor could feel the weight of her gaze. She was measuring him, testing him, deciding whether he would be one of the adults who stayed. He sat back in his seat and met her eyes, letting the silence be its own proof. The boardroom was filled with the usual weight of expectation, screens glowing with charts, tablets lined neatly in front of each director, the polished table shining beneath the overhead lights. Conversations buzzed in low tones, the language of profit and strategy moving like a steady current around the room. Victor entered without a briefcase, without the stack of reports that usually accompanied him. In his hand he carried only a single rose, its stem trimmed, its petals faintly curled but still vivid in color. The directors watched him curiously as he took his seat at the head of the table, placing the flower in the center as though it belonged there. There was a ripple of whispers, a few puzzled looks, but Victor said nothing at first. He let the rose sit against the polished surface, its small presence a disruption to the familiar order of graphs and projections. When the room settled, he leaned forward, his voice steady but stripped of the corporate cadence they were used to hearing. He told them a story, not of markets or mergers, but of a rainy night when a child stood on a corner selling flowers. He spoke of her words, of the way she handed him a rose and told him sometimes people need proof they are still alive. The directors shifted in their seats, some frowning, some listening more closely than they intended. Victor continued, describing the apartment where the lights flickered, the thin blanket over a sick mother, the notebook filled with numbers too precise for a 9-year-old to carry. He did not raise his voice, did not dramatize, but spoke with conviction, each sentence clear, each detail carrying the weight of truth. He explained that this rose was not decoration, but a reminder, proof that behind every contract and every deal, there were lives pressed against the edge of survival. He told them that their company could not define success only by profits, that the true measure was whether the world beyond their glass walls felt any difference because of what they built. He paused then, letting the silence stretch, the rose between them catching the light. For once the boardroom fell still. No one reached for their tablets, no one interrupted with numbers. They stared at the flower, as though seeing something they could not calculate. One director cleared his throat, ready to protest, but the words caught. Another leaned back, arms crossed, not dismissing but thinking. The silence was heavier than argument, charged with something unfamiliar. Victor told them he was moving forward with the housing and healthcare initiative, with or without their approval, and that he would not measure the cost in percentages, but in lives changed. He said it was time their empire reflected more than power, that it carried proof of being alive. His gaze swept the room, steady and unflinching. When he finished, no one spoke. The rose lay quiet on the table, its fragile petals more powerful than any report they had read that year. Weeks passed, the winter light giving way to the first signs of spring, and with it came the announcement that surprised not only Victor's company, but the entire city. The Lila Fund, launched with quiet precision, its name simple, its mission clear, offering shelter, medical aid, and schooling for children who lived as Lila had, balancing on the thin line between survival and collapse. The fund was not a side project hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. It was a foundation with Victor's name and fortune tied directly to it, a promise that resources would not dry up when profits wavered or when headlines shifted. The press swarmed immediately. Reporters filled the front rows of the first event, cameras flashing as Victor stood at the podium. His suit was dark, his voice calm, but there was no corporate polish in the words he spoke. He did not talk about shareholders or long-term projections. He spoke about children selling flowers in the rain, about numbers scribbled in a notebook, about a rose that reminded him that proof of being alive was not measured in profit, but in the small acts of staying, of helping, of refusing to look away. The questions came fast, some sharp, some skeptical. Was this an attempt to soften his image after years of being known as a ruthless strategist? Was it a distraction from business setbacks? Was it a calculated move to gain favor with politicians? Victor listened to them all, and when the room grew restless, he answered with a single sentence that stilled the noise. Because a child reminded me what life is for. The simplicity of it disarmed them. Some pressed further, asking who the child was, but he declined to name her, saying the fund was not about one story, but about the countless stories like hers, stories hidden in the corners of the city that most people never noticed. He promised the foundation would not only give temporary aid, but build long-term stability, housing that could not be lost with one late payment, clinics that welcomed without shame, schools where teachers stayed long enough to matter. Weeks later, families began moving into the first renovated apartments, the smell of fresh paint replacing the mold that had clung to their walls. Children carried new books into classrooms, where meals were provided alongside lessons, where no one was invisible. Victor visited quietly, without press, walking through halls where laughter replaced silence. He watched as Lila walked beside her mother, showing her the small library corner, pointing out the shelves of medicine at the clinic that no longer required desperate bargaining. At night, articles appeared across financial papers, some praising him, some doubting him. But Victor no longer read them with the hunger he once had. He measured success in the way Lila's shoulders eased when she no longer had to count coins for rent, in the way her mother smiled without apology. The empire he had built still stood, but beside it grew something new, something that mattered more. For the first time, his foundation was not made of glass and steel, but of lives steadied and lifted. The morning was bright, the kind of brightness that felt like a gift after months of gray skies and endless storms. The air carried the scent of spring, soft and clean, and the sidewalks sparkled with dew that had not yet burned away. Children walked in clusters toward the schoolyard, their voices rising in cheerful bursts, the sound of backpacks shifting against small shoulders, the promise of something ordinary yet precious. Among them was Lila, her steps light, her dress no longer thin from weather, her shoes sturdy, her arms filled with fresh notebooks. She held them with a kind of reverence, the pages smooth and waiting, a quiet proof that her nights on the corner with roses wrapped in newspaper had ended. She paused before entering the building, looking at the wide doors that opened to classrooms, where she no longer had to arrive late and tired, no longer had to explain homework undone, because evenings had been for survival. She breathed in, steady and sure, then walked inside, her notebooks pressed close, her eyes shining not with suspicion but with hope. The teachers greeted her warmly, one placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, as if already recognizing the shift in her life, the transformation that had carried her from the cold street into this bright hallway. At the same time, across the city, Victor sat in his office surrounded by the usual quiet hum of machines and the low murmur of assistants in the hall. The rose he had once carried still lingered in his mind, though its petals had long since fallen. He was reviewing schedules, meetings lined up like a familiar wall, when his assistant appeared with a puzzled smile and handed him something small. A single rose, placed on his desk with careful hands, its stem straight, its bloom fresh and vivid. Attached was a folded note written in neat letters, for someone who finally smiled. Victor stared at the words, his breath caught for a moment, his throat tightening in a way he could not control. He sat back in his chair, the sunlight pouring across the desk, touching the rose, turning its petals into a blaze of red. He thought of the first night he had seen her, standing in the rain with feet bare and voice steady, offering a flower to a stranger. He thought of the café, the ledger, the empty apartment, the way her words had cut through his armor and forced him to see. And now here was proof, not only that she had survived, but that she was beginning to thrive. Her gift transformed into a message, simple yet profound. For the first time in years, Victor smiled. Not the polished smile he had worn for photographs, not the practiced grin for investors, but a smile that rose from deep within, unexpected and real. It spread across his face like sunlight breaking through clouds, and in that moment he felt something he had not in a long time. Something Lila had insisted mattered most. He felt alive. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.